session. But for today's session, welcome all. And we have today's topic in Let Us Talk It as overview of API management, features of an API management platform for digital business, from designing and publishing APIs for developers to API traffic management, security, and analytics. And to give the in-depth knowledge, to learn more about it, we have our guest speaker, who is Sai Surya Chintala. He did his master's from University of Texas. And he started his career as a Java developer and slowly evolved into API design developer, microservices specialist. And I have to say, he's a man of very, very few words. As much as I tried introspecting and going into and asking him what else he loves to do, then just a two-line came in that he loves to hike, he loves, to play the guitar. So yes, the man of less words, but a man of immense knowledge. So we are honored to have you, Sai. Over to you.
Morning all, good afternoon or good morning, depending on what time zone you guys are in. Welcome all, and thanks a lot, Zulin, for setting up the stage. And I'll try to be use more words this time, not we'll be very precise. Thank you for this opportunity, first of all. And not beating around the bush anymore, let's get started. So today I really wanted to share my knowledge or my experience that I've spent around with API management as such. So with the title itself, I mean, we just wanted to get a high level understanding of what API management is. So in order to understand that, I think it's very important to understand what APIs are, and then what is involved with the management of these APIs. So let's get started. Just a quick agenda. What we're going to do this today. So we'll just talk a little about what APIs are, and then we'll talk about what API management is involved. Why do we really need to manage our APIs, and what all the features or what are we buying with API management. And we'll see who the current players are in the market that are offering these management solutions, and then we'll have a question and answer session. We'll have some discussions, throw out on some ideas, and then we'll call it an end. So let's talk what are APIs. As Wikipedia, it says it's basically API stands for an application programming interface. Coming from a tech background, I mean, most of you might have already heard about this term APIs probably a zillion times already. And from the definition itself, what does it say? It is nothing but it's an interface that is created so that multiple software intermediaries or two components are talking to each other. So with a lot of digital transformation or digitalization happening, and the user experiences are the businesses are running in such a way that user experience is one of the most significant things that the businesses are buying for. So APIs play such a big role. I mean, even before going into a lot about digital transformation and stuff. So basically APIs, coming from this tech background, right? I mean, you might have already used a lot of APIs, just not heard of it. Like, you want to convert a string into a number, or a number into a string, you might have used some basic Java APIs. So what does it do? You give in an input, you get out an output. What is that the API doing? It's performing a business function, or it's performing a predefined task. So it's as rudimentary as that. So now, again, pitching back onto the digital transformation. So how do these APIs enable digital transformation? How important of a role do they play? So let's talk a little. So let's talk about how APIs are actually playing a vital role in our day-to-day life. Forget about being a developer, or forget about being in the tech industry. I mean, you want to go out, you want to use your Google Maps, you want to navigate to a different place. You just open your app and you put in an information, or you want to search a location, or you want to search a good restaurant. So you put in some information, and how are we getting that search list, or how are we getting data that is sitting somewhere in Google servers right into your into your mobile or device or your car navigation system in a matter of seconds or even less. So APIs are building, or are the building blocks of such communication. So just it's just not confined to Google Maps or any other stuff. I mean, we see an overwhelmingly number of applications in our day-to-day life. You log into your Instagram, or you connect to some application using Facebook. You use your YouTube, or in your work life you use Slack or Teams or any messaging real-time messaging services. Or if you are more into repositories, or your source code control like GitHub. So basically there are a lot of APIs that are that just around us, which are making our lives easier. So with so many APIs and in the world, or in the business, in this digital transformation life, so how do we manage them effectively? So even before getting that, so let's take a look at how many these stalwart companies like Twitter, Facebook, eBay, and Netflix, how are they using these APIs? So in Twitter itself, I mean, if you can see the stats here, the complete business is based on API and developer applications. Of 75% traffic comes just from the APIs for Twitter, and 90% of the annual revenue for Expedia is around $6.6 billion. So similarly with Salesforce, eBay, and Netflix, I mean, there are a lot of revenue. I mean, there's a lot of monetary value attached to these APIs. So when you see that there is so much potential for these APIs and there is so much weight around these, so you'll definitely want to manage them first, or you want to do it effectively. Just not do it effectively. So now we've talking about what APIs are and how much significance they have in this current digital world. So let's get started, or let's dive into why do we need API management. Okay, now I have APIs. Yes, they're functioning. I have my YouTube APIs. I have my Google APIs. I have whatever APIs we're using. Why do I need to manage them? So let's ask that question. Do we really need it? So in order to ask the why, in order to ask the why, we need to ask a few how questions. How can I do some stuff? So let's start with those questions. How do I manage the consumptions of an API across my enterprise? So you have a huge enterprise, or you could be a small, medium, large, and a huge enterprise. So when you have so many APIs that your API developers are developing every day or every sprint, how do you manage that they're being consumed by the right person? And how do you provide self-service to internal and external developers? So let's talk a standard use case, right? I mean, Google provides lots of APIs. So let's talk about the Google Maps API. So you do not directly talk, or you do not write an email, or you do not call somebody from Google and say, hey, I want to use this API. You do it by yourself. You just log into Google, you find the right API, you want to subscribe to it, you just use it, you get your credentials, you get all your metadata that is required for that, and you start working on it. So it's more of self-service, right? I mean, so how can you provide this self-service to internal and external, or any developer who wants to call or consume an API? And how do you enforce security at runtime? So with so much of data that is being sailed across this world, you really want to put some security, enforce some security on your API, because there could be some confidential data, there could be some internal data, there could be public data. So depending on your data classification, you want to secure your API with as minimal effort as possible, right? And the next how is how to throttle and provide controlled access. So one of the biggest challenges that we see is, okay, let's say I want to create an API and I want to expose this to the public, or I want to expose it to a specific B2B customer or a B2C customer entity. So how do you make sure that it reaches the right person? And how do you make sure that they're not abusing the API, right? So how do you do that? And of course, with APIs, and you want to manage the API lifecycle, you want to bring in new versions, you want to fix some bugs, you want to bring in some features, or you want to create a new major API itself. So how do you effectively or efficiently do this? without having a lot of overhead of manual stuff around it. And how do you know who is using your API and how much are they using it? And if there is a potential to make money out of it, how can I charge them? Or how can I keep a track of, okay, this customer has called this API these many times, I'm going to charge him for this? How do you automate all this stuff? So in order to, so all these how questions that uh, you see here, if you have the answers, or if you do not have the answers, that gives why you need to use API management. So let's go in a little detail. So this is basically a typical API management layout, or the actors and the components that are involved. So let's take a few minutes to understand basically what API management is, and then we'll start picking up what it provides us to the enterprise, or to a company. So let's start from the flow. Let's start with the from a right to left approach here. So if you see to the right most corner, there's a guy sitting with a laptop, and you see API managers and API developers. So let's say so this is where the ideas and the inception started. So there is a guy like me, or somebody, a developer, and he has a potential API and he wants to publish it, so that anyone across the world can start using the API, and he knows exactly who's using it, and he can charge money out of it. So what does he do? So he designs his API, he develops his API, he publishes it to the blue block that we have here, called the API portal. So the API portal can also be referred as API manager, or a provider portal, or an API portal, all mean the same. So what does an API portal or an API manager do? So the sole responsibility of an API manager is to let the developers design their APIs, develop their APIs, and publish them. So the API manager, once a developer comes onto a API portal, designs, develops, and publishes the API. So the flow goes on. The task that API portal does is it has two tasks to do. One is to push a copy to the gateway, and the other is to push a copy to the developer portal. So let's talk what is a gateway, what is a developer portal, and also what is an API portal in detail in the coming slides. But what essentially these three components make up the API management is that the API portal is responsible in publishing, or providing APIs, and the gateway is responsible to host your services, to whatever logic, or whatever orchestration, or whatever service integration that you're doing. The gateway is responsible, so that some client can, or an application can consume your API. So the gateway is basically, like, I would say, the heart of the system. And then the other important component is the developer portal. So what is a developer portal? A developer portal is essentially a website, or a web application that builds like a service catalog, like an API catalog of what all APIs your enterprise has. So the developer portal basically enables a self-service pattern to clients, or to consumers, where they can come onto the developer portal, view their APIs, subscribe their APIs. If you see, they can discover what APIs there are there, and they can try out some samples. They get to see some documentation, and with that information from the developer portal, they can go into their source code, and they can start integrating with that API, so that their apps can talk to the gateway and complete the flow. So the flow is that the consumers, or the providers design, develop APIs using the API portal, and the API portal publishes it to the gateway and the developer portal. And then the clients, or the consumers, or the application developers come onto the portal, get the metadata, find out what API this is, what version, what does it perform, and then they integrate into their applications, which talk to the gateway in order to finish that business function. So now that we've identified that these are the three important components in a proper API management solution, so now let's see, or deep dive into each component and what it brings on to the team. So let's talk about the API manager or the provider portal. As I just said, there's a different lingo around attached to it. People call it the API portal or the provider portal or API manager. They're all are the same. And also, I mean, it's more of a maybe a branding strategy, because API management solutions are being offered by multiple vendors and multiple companies. They just tend to have their own branding. Some call the API manager, some call the provider portal. So enough of the naming strategy. So let's see what in detail what the API manager does. So as we just discussed, it helps an enterprise or an API developer to design, develop, and publish APIs. And what else can it do? It can orchestrate, secure, and document your API's flow. So let's say you want to build an after API. When I say an after API, the API can work for US, for Mexico, for Canada. Let's assume there is some business functionality. So let's say you have 3 different backend services that are providing data for US, one for Mexico, one for Canada. So you want to orchestrate your API in such a way that depending on which country the API is being called from, or depending on the request parameter that is being sent, you can orchestrate your flow in such a way that, hey, if the requester is asking for a US data, make sure it goes to the US service. If it's Canada, make sure it goes to the Canada and not to the other 2 services. So that way you can orchestrate, and if you have complex flows, you can build those complex flows. Let's say you have to call 3 different microservices or 3 different backend services in order to provide an API. So you can build all of that using your API manager. And secure, how can you secure your API? We'll talk about what security options the API management as a platform brings onto the team. But you can from the management portal itself, you can secure your APIs. Okay, is my API public, providing public data, or is it giving internal data, or is it giving confidential data? So depending on your data classification, you can enable a different level of securities that are being offered. And the most important thing, I'd say, or one of the most important things is documentation. So let's say if I design an API, develop an API today, and you do not document it works today fine. Let's say I move to a different company, or I move to a different team, and people who are coming on or people who want to consume this API, they have no clue what the requests are, or how the response is, what business function this does, unless and until I explicitly document this API flow, which is a little overhead on the developers. I mean, coming from a developer fraternity, I mean, we most of us, we do not like to document. We are all interested in designing the API and publishing it and make sure it works fine. But one of the biggest things or most important things that the API management does is, as you develop, you have the ability to document your API. And once you document your API, a Swagger is created. I assume most of them already know about Swagger, but it's an open API specification. It's basically a specification file for your API, telling that what it does and how it needs to be called, how it responds. So let's think WSDL to a SOAP service, a Swagger for a REST API. So documentation is taken care of. And you'll definitely want to manage your API lifecycle. So if you see the image on the right, so probably where you start in an agile methodology is you plan your API, and then you design your API saying that, okay, this is what it needs to do. And then once your design is solidified, then you start developing it, you test it, you deploy it. Then at some point you might want to come up with a newer version of it. So you'll have to retire, or delete an existing or the older versions. So in such methodologies, or you want to efficiently manage your API lifecycle, saying that, okay, now this is going to be my live version. Okay, now I want to replace this version with a bug fix, or I want to parallelly have 2 different versions of an API. So all of this can be very efficiently performed using the API manager. And what else does the API manager do? So behind the scenes, the API manager is basically a management server that's running somewhere. So it collects analytics. So analytics seems to be a very, very important thing that the API manager brings onto the team. So it basically collects the analytics. We'll definitely talk a little more about analytics in the further slides. So that's about the analytics piece. and approve and reject subscription requests. So you might be a little puzzled about what a subscription request, who puts them, who accepts them. So basically with API management and self-service enabled, you can control your API to be, to be subscribable. As in, so you deploy an API or you publish an API today, and you want to make sure that whoever wants to consume your API, you want to make sure they put in a request. They just cannot use it for their wish. They have to request, and then once you approve it, and so only then they can start using it. So that kind of a workflow, or, that flow is you can enable or disable those kind of flows depending on your business strategy. You can do that just with a click of a button, and you can approve and reject your subscription requests. And also you can you can onboard your new developers. You can give them different roles in order to design, develop, and publish your APIs. So that's a little about the API manager, and we'll talk a little more about it. So you can create products. So you might be a little, a foreign if you haven't used any API management solution to the term called products. So products is nothing but a set of APIs, bundled up together. So let's say you want to build an API based on the business functions. So let's say you have 5 or 6 APIs that all come under one business function. Let's say you're building a weather API. You can accommodate, or you can bundle up all your weather APIs together and create a weather product. That way you can market your APIs, or that way you can categorize and streamline your APIs into one product and tie them up and sell them together as one single product. So with this product, so let's say you have one product with 5 or 6 different APIs. So you'll definitely want to grant access by their usage. So that's where plans come. So if you see the image there, so plans could be as simple as you're definitely familiar with this plans of Netflix or Amazon, or any OTT platforms, where you can have some subscription plans. You pay this much, you get so for example, you want to go for a basic plan. It gives only 500 API calls per month, and then after that it's going to cost you 1 cent. So let's say that's the basic plan. And you're going to pro plan, you can get 1,000 calls per month. And if you want to ultra plan, you get 5,000 calls per month. So that way you can set different plans, and you can also set their quota limits at each plan level, and assign these different plans to a product. So that way, so let's say this weather APIs that I'm marketing, I have a reason or a use case where I want to probably call only 100 times a month. So that way I do not need to sell $25 a month. I can just use the basic plan. But let's say I'm creating a very intuitive app, and it's almost like real time. I need to get data. So I could get more than 3,000 or 4,000 calls monthly. So then I can have this ultra plan. So that way, depending on your business use case, you can create different plans and throttle your APIs accordingly and tie them up with products. So that's one thing you could definitely do in the API manager. And also another thing is you can configure your API visibility. So let's say you are publishing it externally, but you want to you want to allow visibility of an API only to certain groups. So let's say maybe you want to tag them geographically, or you want to tag them based on any other a unique criteria. You could easily do that on your API manager as well. So now we've talked a little about the API manager. So let's now talk about the API gateway. So the API, so if the API gateway, as I just mentioned, is the heart of the API management solution, the API provider, or the provider portal, or the management server can be considered as the brain. It keeps on collecting. It makes sure that every action that you do is is being communicated with all the components in the solution. So what does the API gateway do? It's a prime runtime or a host for your APIs published via your API manager. So as we just mentioned in a couple of slides earlier, so when you create an API and when you publish it, so the API manager brings that source, or the main the logic of the API, and deploys it onto your API gateway. And the API gateway, again, it varies from product to product. IBM has Data Power, and Apigee has Edge Micro Gateways, and depending on what solution you want. But an API gateway is definitely there, which actually acts like a single point of entry for all your APIs. So anybody calling from anywhere in the world, they have to come through your gateway, and they cannot access your backend services directly. So that way you're abstracting or creating an abstraction layer in between with an API gateway. And what else does it do? One of the most important, or the significance of an API gateway, it provides AAA. What does AAA stand for, or AAA stand for? Is to audit, authenticate, and authorize. So you want to secure your APIs, you want to know who is calling, you want to know it's not being abused. All this kind of important functionalities are brought to the system by the API gateway. Along with AAA, what else does it do? It routes your APIs. So just as we mentioned, the standard use case, you want to call 3 different services depending on the input, you can route your APIs. You can add a caching layer after your gateway. Instead of if you want to reduce your calls to your databases or to your backend services, you can enable caching in between. And then throttling is very important. So let's say if you are exposing it to public, and you don't want somebody to bring down your server just by let's say they put it in an infinite loop and they start calling your API. You definitely do not want to let that happen in such a system. So you want to throttle your APIs, you want to control who's calling, and you want to definitely perform some transformations. So let's say somebody is sending in a JSON request as an input, but your backend services takes in XML. So your JSON to XML transformations can be very, very easily performed by an API gateway. And one of the important things, that API management brings on the board is that it works more of a configuration based rather than coding based. So what does it mean? So all you do is, so let's say the routing you're performing, or the transformations that you're performing, the API gateways generally have the concept of policies. So policies are nothing but a predefined piece of code that is already there. So let's say if you want to convert JSON to XML or vice versa, so there's already a pre-built defined policy available on these API gateways that you can just drag and drop onto your orchestration, and say that, hey, if I get a JSON request, convert it to XML and call an endpoint, or vice versa. So all these, there are different policies depending on what management solution you're buying, but most of them do have these out of the box policies, which enable, instead of you to code, you can just configure. You can just drag and drop those configuration policies to perform some default functions. So so that's about your API gateway. So now let's talk about the developer portal. As we just mentioned, so the developer portal is, it's like a one-stop shop. So let's consider the developer portal as your app store on your iOS devices, or your Play Store on your Android devices. So you want to see what all apps are there. You want to install a calculator app, or you want to install some maps app. So all you do is go into your portal, or your app store, and you search for an app, install it, buy it if needed, and then you start using it. So it's all self-service based. So that's exactly what the developer portal is going to enable. But instead of applications, it's going to be an API. So and also these developer portals, do you need to design them? Do you need to write HTML, JavaScript, AngularJS? Do you need to design all of this? No. So this comes out of the box again from the API management solution, and it's fully customizable. So whatever boilerplate they're going to give, most of them, they could be AngularJS websites, or most of them will be Drupal based websites, where you can completely customize the look and feel of your developer portal. And also, there's the documentation of the APIs is available on the developer portal. So that's about the Swagger thing. So the Swagger is automatically generated. You don't need to create the Swagger from the scratch. So as you build your API, so the Swagger is automatically being generated by the platform to you. And also, yes, it enables self-service. People can go into developer portal, view the API, subscribe them, start using it into their applications. And so that also enables the clients to search your APIs, subscribe your APIs. And one of the important things is they can try the APIs, they can test the APIs on the developer portal itself. So you don't need to actually go into a REST client, or you don't need to wait for your developer to start using it into their specific application to try it out. So let's say there's a business user who's actually looking for an API, let's say a UPS address validation API or a zip code validator API. So the business can actually log into the USPS or the UPS developer portal, search them, and they can just try it out on the portal itself instead of actually depending on REST client or a developer. So that actually enables the business to more interact in the IT side of things as well. And another important thing that API management brings us is auto-generated keys, or for the clients to consume your APIs. So let's say without any API management solution previously, how do we use to authenticate, or how do we provide credentials? So let's say I'm an API developer, I have an XML file where I put in my credentials and I give it to a client one. So today there's just one client, so I just have one set of username and password credentials for that user. So let's say my API is going to be now used by multiple people, and I want to have different credentials for all of them. So let's say, they're going to be 50 different consumers down the road. I do not want to maintain all of that by myself. I do not want to create those passwords. I do not want to create these usernames. So what API management brings is, when you go onto a developer portal, when you want to subscribe to an API, the API keys or the credentials are automatically generated by the platform itself. So we are kind of completely cutting down the overhead of managing the credentials in your vault, or any location, for a matter of fact. So that's one good thing about having developer portal. So we've seen a lot of this, we've talked a lot about this, but it's always definitely good to visualize and to see something in real. So one of those examples we're going to use is Royal Mail. So Royal Mail is basically a mailing service from United Kingdom, from UK. And we're going to use one of their portals, which is accessible over the internet. I can give you the link after this, and you can start viewing them as well. So what are we going to do in this demo? We're going to quickly browse through the APIs, view the documentation, register an application, subscribe, and test an API. So let's do that right away. I'm assuming you guys can see my screen now.
Yes.
Okay, excellent. So this is a developer portal of the Royal Mail. So Royal Mail, as I just mentioned, is a logistics company based out of UK. So what I can do here is, so this is basically a look. I mean, this is definitely customizable as per your business needs. So, but let's see what all APIs does Royal Mail currently have. So when I click on this API library here, so basically it's going to show me what all different APIs Royal Mail is offering. So it has some office finders, it has a shipping API version 3, it has a collect v2, and it has a tracking service. So if you see, it's also mentioning what kind of an API. Is it a REST based API, or is it a SOAP protocol API? And it gives you description as well. So all this information is coming out from the API manager. When you're designing your let's say this Office Finder API, you put in your description there, and it automatically is being rendered onto your portal. So when you click on this API, it's going to show you. So this is basically the screen, or the specification of your API. So it's going to give you a description. It is going to provide some endpoints on how do you consume this API. It's also going to tell you HTTP method. Is it going to be a GET? Is it going to be a put, post? Depending on your CRUD operations, and it gives you a summary, and it also tells you what kind of security is being attached to this API. Does it need a client ID? Does it need a client secret? Or is it an OAuth 2 protected API? And what all parameters are required. So basically, in and out of an API, depending on what API that is, it's going to provide you all the details about it. It's going to tell you what a sample response is going to look like. It's going to tell you what endpoint you're going to call it. It's going to tell you what methods you want to use. So all of that is very elaborately and very intuitively documented here on the developer portal. And most of the portals also give you some snippet codes, in case if you're building a Java application, all you have to do is to use this piece of code. Or let's say if you're doing it in Python, you can just use this piece of code. So there is so much that the developer portals are providing it to this. So let's move forward, and let's try to subscribe. So as we mentioned, we just talked about plans. So this is one real life example of what a plan could be. So it could be a goal plan, and it is telling that I can call only one per second, and it is free of cost. I cannot make 2 calls per second. It's going to restrict me. So the API gateway, which is enabling the throttling, is going to cut me down if I make more than 1 calls per second for this. But how does the API management know that it's me that I'm calling? It's not somebody else's application. So if in order to subscribe to an API, so there's this concept called application. So when you register an application, you get an identity. So the management server knows that, okay, somebody named Sai Surya Chintala has created an application and is subscribing to this Office Finder V1 API. So now I know who is calling my API. So let's say I call it a test app. And once I submit, I'm going to get my credentials right away. I do not need to wait for any time. It just gives me, the client secret is right here. My client ID is right here. So I know I can start off my development right away. So now with this client ID and client secret, now I can start testing my API. I can go back to my library. Now that my app is created, I just go back to the API and subscribe to it before testing it. I click on subscribe, and it's going to ask me, okay, which application does need the authorization to this API. So now I'll click on this, and I click on subscribe. But the only downside to this demo is that somebody needs to approve this. So this API is not going to work, but it's going to, it's not going to work in a positive case. It's just going to throw me an error that you're not authorized. But it is going to tell me that, hey, you put in a request and somebody is going to approve it. Only then can I start using it. So I'll just quickly show you, how you can test the API on the platform itself. So you go down here, you see on the right bottom corner, there is an option to try this operation. So when if I want to try or get all the delivery offices that are available, all I have to do is to, choose my client ID, put in the client secret, which I just got it from there, and just provide a postal code. Okay, when I click on call operation, I'm probably going to get a 401 saying that unauthorized request. But if you see, the response from the API is coming right away onto the portal. I did not need any postman. I did not need any developer access to it. All I had to do is to create my application and test it right away. If somebody from Royal Mail, from their admin team approves that, okay, Sai wants to use this API, let me go and approve it, then probably I'll get a 200 okay success response, depending on what information I provided. So this is, I just wanted to make sure that you guys have an experience or a view of, what a developer portal is providing. You can search APIs, you can onboard your other customers or, other teammates from your team, and you can create applications. You can get your client credentials. In case, let's say you expose the client secret in some email and you want to reset it, you can do that as well on the application, on your portal here. You can come in and say, hey, I just want to reset my client ID because it's been all exposed. So all these kind of functionalities can be performed on your developer portal. And interesting thing is, you can also find analytics. So let's say you made some calls, you want to see how your application is performing, you want to see how many calls you made, if there is any latency, and all that sort is going to show up here. Just to save some time, I know we're kind of crunching to the end. I'll just proceed with my presentation. So let me share my slide back. So let's continue. What's this? Let's see here. Okay, so now that we've quickly gone through a demo of how the developer portal works, so now let's talk what all what other functionalities or features is the API management bringing me. So as we mentioned, we can secure your API at the runtime itself. So what is the advantage of securing the API on the gateway rather than securing at the microservice level? So at the microservice level, let's say you're building a Java Spring Boot application or a Python application or a C# application, you are kind of avoiding a lot of boilerplate code that needs to go into the code or your application in order to enable basic authentication, or if you want to enable OAuth 2. So all of these features that you're seeing here, the API key authentication or basic authentication or OAuth 2, all of these features are automatically or out of the box features of the API management solution. So just with a click of a button, you can choose what kind of API security you want to have for your API, on the API manager itself. So an API developer goes into the API manager while developing the API and can choose what kind of security he wants to use. So these three options are one of the most commonly used security patterns in current days. So API keys, you just pass in the API key that we just generated in the demo. And you can also use basic authentication where you have a username and password basically connecting to your LDAP or any authentication server behind the scenes. And you can also have OAuth 2, which is one of the industry standard security patterns. So you could use all of this without having an overhead burden of a lot of boilerplate code to lock down your microservices. So that's really helpful with API management. And the other important thing is your API analytics or insights to your APIs. So let's say you've already gone ahead with implementing your management solution in your enterprise, and you want to see who is causing or call invoking most of your APIs, who is your most valued customer, or you want to calculate some business insights, you want to measure some KPIs of how intensively or how much is your API your gateway is being used, or is it performing slow, or am I reaching too much operational costs? Do I need to scale up to have more resources? So all of this information can be easily derived from the API analytics. And as we mentioned, the API manager is responsible to collect all these analytics from the developer portal and from the gateway. And it basically can persist up to 90 days, or depending on the solution, you can persist all those analytic information in your servers. And the most important or very good thing is that you can export, you can ship out these analytic logs onto your onto your ELK stacks, like probably you can have Splunk or Kibana or Sumo Logic, any log aggregator. You can forward those logs and you can build your dashboards, and can have some reports that you have to show it to your business, saying that, hey, the vehicle API that we built last month is being called 100,000 times because of 20 customers we have. Tomorrow we are going to onboard 20 more customers, so we need an operational resource to scale up the servers. So all these kinds of insights are very helpful from a business and a infrastructure standpoint. So that is one thing that is really helpful, and a very significant value that API management brings. And the last, or the we're coming to the end. And so if you want to monetize your API, so let's say how Google, Facebook, or any API for that matter, they are costing you for the services that they're providing you. So with most of the API management solutions that are available in the market today, you can monetize your API. So at the plan itself, if you remember, you see on the Royal Mail developer portal, you see the gold plan, it said free. So instead, if you want to make sure that you want to, let's say you're passing in very critical information, or that's not publicly available, and you want to put a cost to it, you can directly attach it, and the API management server has access to different financial providers, where you can automatically generate revenue from the customer. So the customer enters their credit card information in the developer portal, and depending on the usage, depending on the number of calls that the analytics is building up over a period of time, it says after 30 days, okay, you made 100,000 calls, so I'm going to charge you this much for this. So you can create these kind of revenue models with API monetization enabled. You can have pay as you go patterns. You have tired, let's say you have like you want to put it as 500,000 calls are going to be this much. So anything under that 500,000 calls, this is what you pay, and above that, you're going to have a different slab. Or you can have free APIs, just like our weather APIs, and then you have unit based, as per how many units you want to charge them, and also by by the transaction fee. So all these kind of revenue models can be integrated using your API monetization. So with this, with as we just discussed, with so much of APIs that are revolving around us, there's so much potential to monetize your APIs, and start to bring out or to build a revenue on that. So that's definitely a bonus, a very important uh, feature that that we get on board with API management solution. And this is a little more technical topology. You can also have CI/CD, continuous integration and continuous delivery enabled with API management solutions as well. So if you see, this is where it will start, the developer toolkit. They start, they finish their development on their local machines, and they push it into GitHub, and GitHub then pushes your code onto your API management node. That is nothing but just like publishing an API, which if you remember, the API management has two tasks. One is to publish the API to a gateway, or to publish a copy of it to the developer portal, which it does. And then the clients, the consumers who want to come onto the portal, they can come here, subscribe their APIs, and get their credentials, and then they start using it into their mobile applications, or their IoT devices or business apps, and they start calling the endpoint, which actually directs it to the API gateway. And the API gateway, which is orchestrating, routing your different API, goes to your backend services, depending on what kind of services are there. It's like single point of entry into your enterprise, and it does all the transformations behind the scenes, and uh, serves your requests and response. So this is a very high level understanding, a little technical a bit, but that's about the API management solution. And quickly just going through, who are the current players who are offering these API management solutions. So this is just one illustration of that. So Apogee is a Google product, which is offering their solutions. Then we have IBM's API Connect. Then we have Acana. Then we have Kong Enterprise, 3Scale. You name it. You have multiple uh, providers providing API management, and this is just one example of that. And this is just to understand the market share, who's how many companies are using it, and IBM's products. Then there is CA's API management, then there is Microsoft's Azure API management, then you have Google's Apogee. So there are a lot of players around, and you definitely want to choose the right one depending on your business needs, depending on your budget, depending on your enterprise architecture. So you want to make a decision on that. I mean, if there's really a good need of an API management solution in your enterprise, that's this information that you picked up today will definitely help you if you're looking into that direction. And I think we are to an end of today's session. I really want to open up the floor for questions, discussions, any thoughts.